thank you everyone for joining us. As I just said, for those who didn't hear me, my name's Richard. I'm part of the team at Volans. I'm standing in for Louise as host of book club this month. And it's a real honor to introduce Sonja Haut, who will be our guest this month. So Sonja is head of Impact Valuation at Novartis and author of a book called The Case for Impact, a guide to creating value in a world of social and environmental challenges. And this is, I have to say, going to be a fun conversation for me on a number of different levels. So Sonja is, I would say, both a pioneer and a practitioner in the field of impact valuation. And one of the things I really like about this book, and hopefully that will come out of today's conversation, is that it's not just a theoretical exercise or a kind of in principle conversation we can have. You know, Sonja has over the last 10 years actually operationalized this inside a big company, so we can talk very practically about things. But before we get started, I should just do a couple of bits of housekeeping, which is to say, first of all, if you are able to turn your camera on, please do. It just makes it a much nicer experience for me and Sonja if we can be talking to a screen full of faces rather than a screen full of blank pages and names. But please don't unmute yourself unless we ask you to do so, so that we're not we don't get background noise. But please do use the chat function to ask questions. I have a lot of questions for Sonja, but I want to make sure we take as many of your questions as well as possible. So please do put questions in the chat and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So Sonja, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Richard, and the Volans team. It's been quite a while that we've been trying to fix that date, and now it's happening. It's a great occasion to be here and discuss things. Looking forward, Richard. Thanks for the prep.
So you mentioned it's been quite a while. It has been quite a while because the book actually came out, I think, in 2022. So that will give people a sense of how long we've been working on getting this in the diary. But actually, I think that makes this fun in a way that means we'll talk about the book and what's in it, but we will also talk a little bit about how the world has changed since 2022 and what that means for some of the ideas and arguments that you put forward in the book and the extent to which your thinking has evolved since then. But let's start with the book itself. And what I want to do in this time is kind of explore this idea of impact valuation. And actually, in a second, I might ask you just to give a basic definition for anyone who's not familiar with this field. But explore this field of impact valuation through three lenses. And I have to say, one of the things that happens to you if you work at Volans as long as I have and work with John Elkington, it means everything has to come in threes and the three things have to alliterate. So we're going to have a philosophical conversation about impact valuation. You know, what is the case for it? Why do we think it's a useful thing to do? Some of the ethical considerations around it. Then we're going to have a very practical conversation about operationalizing it. What does that look like? How do you do it? And then I want to finish up also with a personal conversation, because Sonja, this has been a 10-year journey for you, very much a passion project. You know, you are and have been an entrepreneur, and want to take some time also to reflect on that journey and what you've learned along the way. So, so with that framing, maybe can we start with, so impact valuation, for someone who's never heard this term before, Sonja, what does it mean?
It's about measuring what makes a difference, not stopping with measuring just the inputs and the outputs, as we mostly do, particularly in financial reporting, but then move to outcomes and, if possible, to impacts. And that means all the impacts, the intended and the unintended, the positive and the negative.
Great. And so actually, before we go into impact valuation, I want to start at the very beginning of the book, which is the epigraph, the sort of opening, the quotation you use to open the book is one that many people have come across. It's from F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it talks about the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And I was just curious before we get into all the detail, why you picked that quote? Why does that resonate with you? You know, what, if you like, what are the two opposed ideas that you think we need to be able to hold in our minds?
Well, when I reread this quote, came across it again, I was so struck by it because it's ever so natural that we walk left foot, left foot, right foot, and this is what we do. But when it comes to metrics, it's either the environment or it's society. It's either the context or the granularity. It's either the narrative or the facts. So that's not gonna work. And I found that a very profound statement to say, well, actually, we need to hold all these thoughts, as deep as they are and as seemingly opposed or as widespread as they are, we need to somehow bring it all together. Sustainability and business is another dichotomy that moves along the same lines. It's and still today, people have the tendency to pivot to what is it now? Is it this or that? It's both
Mhm.
and on all these levels.
Mhm. Interesting. So you gave us a short, sharp definition of impact valuation. Let's start the philosophical discussion this way. What would you say is the problem, whether that's, or actually, both the problem both for a business and also at a societal level, to which impact valuation is the solution?
Well, I'd say that um, nature and society are largely invisible to business and to investment. And using impact valuation, that can be changed. Now, in an impact economy, that be changed for business, for investors, for governments, for any type of economic interaction. But, well, we got to start somewhere. The case for impact focuses on impact valuation at businesses.
Mhm. And so we explore that a little bit further. So you make the case in the book and in your work that, as you've said, we should not just measure those impacts across social, environmental, economic, but also translate them into monetary figures, right? And you address some of the concerns that people have around putting dollar signs or euro signs on social and environmental impacts in the book, and I want to get into that a little bit. And maybe let's start with the ethical dimension, because I know you are very sensitive to the discomfort that many people feel. Indeed, I know that you feel about putting a monetary value on the worth of a human life, for example. Um, in fact, you open the section of the book. I hope this isn't a spoiler for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but you open there's a section in the book that's about why monetize impacts. And you start with a very personal story about a friend of yours, Paul, who died when pro-Russian separatists shot down a Malaysian Airlines flight over eastern Ukraine in 2014. And you write that the loss of this remarkable and unique individual cannot be measured by any means, especially money. Uh, and yet you kind of go on to say, ultimately, we do this all the time. We translate the value of human lives into dollar figures, Swiss francs, euros, pounds, whatever. Um, and uh, and that's at the heart of what impact valuation is about. So can you talk us through a little bit how you kind of philosophically square that circle, how you handle the ethics of putting dollar signs on things like human life or on biodiversity and nature?
Well, let me start at the beginning, and that is, if we really want to cut across the invisibility problem for nature and society, then we need to bring about a number of items that are measured in very, very different units of measure. And then how do you compare cubic meters of waters with cases of injuries? And then it becomes odd, right? You have all these different units of measure and they never go together. You have degrees centigrade, and then you have grams and millimoles of whatever substance and so forth. And that also doesn't speak to businesses. But there are two aspects. One is you need a unifying metric to get things on the same footing, and then that could be any score that you invent. You can use some of things that are established, like quality adjusted life years, but then it already gets a bit deep in the specificities, or you use dollars that just happen to be established in business. And um, now, just from a very practical point of view, that has been just a door opener to get into conversation with business leaders. And not on the level of not at all on the level of a value of a life, but on what are these things in their comparative materiality? Because you have a whole breadth of things that are potentially material. You can't manage or go after all of them. So how can you get a sense for what's more important, or where you have the greatest opportunity to really make a difference? And this entire notion of valuing the impacts, having the possibility to bring that together with costs or effort flowing into an activity and then have a social return on investment, all of that only works if you have a common footing of a unit of measure. So it's a practical approach, and it does not mean that anything that shouldn't be marketed gets marketed. But these concerns come from actually, I don't know where they come from, because actually in real life use cases, they haven't come to bear. So no one in my professional environment has ever challenged me on that level. It's been on other aspects, on how the data has come about, on potential concerns of whether these constituencies could react sensitively. But it's been part of the beginning of my journey at Novartis to actually test these approaches, field test them, and try and find sensitive communities to expose them to the concept. And that hasn't been an issue. They've understood and appreciated the intention behind, that is bringing visibility of previously unseen issues to business and have a possibility to engage more broadly with stakeholders of those topics of joint concern.
So that's interesting. Like what you said about the unifying metric makes sense, and yet I guess another concern people sometimes raise, I'm sure you've heard it, I've certainly heard it, about putting dollar signs on social environmental impact, is that it could encourage a trade-off mentality about things that fundamentally shouldn't be seen in that way, because we know money is fungible. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar wherever it is, whereas a ton of CO2 is not really in any way trade-offable against a certain amount of contribution to GDP or occupational health and safety or any of the other things you're measuring here. So how do you?
Yeah, absolutely. And there shouldn't be one single case of forced labor, and for sure not at all of child labor anywhere of this world, on this world. But then the question becomes, is this better than what's currently there, in that these topics are not at all visible and not at all considered? Or does it help to advance a conversation and get a broader engagement on what does that mean? Where does it occur? Where are hotspots? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? What can one do about it? Can one do something about it? And if so, how? So, and here, very simply, to have a targeted conversation that is action orientated and that can come with a concrete set of measures, to me, is preferable to a statement that just bans child labor. I mean, child labor has been banned for years, it's still happening. So apparently that doesn't go far enough, right?
Yeah.
So here's something where we need more. We need action, we need measures. And then how can we encourage that to happen? And for that, we need an engagement. We need to make things visible. And as the moment they're visible, they have the opportunity to be seen and to be acted upon. And that's the entire story.
And so that makes me wonder about, I don't think, you talk quite a bit about your experience over the last 10 years in the book, but I don't think you do at any point pinpoint the moment where, or was there a moment where you went, in order to get these things taken seriously in a business context, we need to put them in monetary terms? Like, was there a sort of single aha moment that made you think that's the route to go down?
Well, you may recall that the approach was tested in different business environments in Kenya and in China to get actually the corporate responsibility foundation type of branch and the core business out there. And then for any of these terms, we actually had rather a broad internal stakeholder engagement. And from those stakeholders representing all the functions, corporates, corporate headquarter and line functions and local leadership, was clear that they wouldn't care about me trying to establish a score or utilize a score that is just new and doesn't relate to anything that is known, or come up or utilize something that is scientific as qualities or so. And things have advanced, and maybe in a health sector that's a different thing altogether. But 10 years ago, this entire thinking was so novel that anything that one could utilize that sounded familiar to something that existed was clear that um, would help to make the message stick or be seen in the first place. And so it was an emergent consensus, was clearly the approach that was discussed as the primary option right from the start. This is what was to be field tested, because all other alternatives are clearly more theoretical in business.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess you are closer to FutureFit. I haven't followed them, how they were faring with their approach to scoring, but I haven't seen that a lot in a corporate environment. Actually, not at all, to be honest.
Yeah. And you do share in the book a little bit about, taking this approach, putting monetary values on impact, did perhaps, reveal some insights or created some maybe surprising conclusions about where where the most material impacts were. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the moment you unearth that, there are always insights, and that really becomes only clear once you produce an impact assessment. I'm here in a private capacity as the author of the book, so I don't feel all too comfortable to go into greater depth on the Novartis side of things. But yeah, absolutely, for both the pilot projects in Kenya and in China, it was very clear that one wasn't aware of the amount actually of the economic impact for starters, but then also of how all the other impacts interrelate. And I guess an interesting larger conference using this concept together with a capitals approach was then run by the colleagues in Italy, bringing that together and exposing that to all of their constituencies. And I guess it wasn't necessarily the one thing. It's more bringing additional densities to what's possibly known. And what I mean by that, it's just a tad more tangible and a tad more actionable. So the topics of innovation and access being material items for any pharmaceutical is certainly not a surprise. And then the question becomes how much of a material topic is that, and what are the facets underpinning that. But I guess that's true for any business, in the sense that once you run these numbers, you may get facets out of your, now in the meantime, double materiality lens that hasn't been there that way, and where you have a way to still structure things in a common framework instead of having just a long list of several dozens in the best case, or even hundreds of
Yeah.
other less organized metrics.
Yeah. Makes sense. We could continue talking about the why for forever, but I promised to get practical. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the practicalities of doing this. You have a whole chapter in the book on operationalizing impact. In fact, I think it might be the longest chapter in the book, or close to it anyway. Um, and I want to start with the basics of how do you gather up all the data you need to do an impact valuation exercise? Because I have to say, as someone who's never done this, um, that feels pretty daunting, just thinking about where am I going to get all the data I need for all of these different social, environmental, economic impacts. And I was quite relieved when reading your book, it made it sound like it's really not that big a deal. It's not nearly as hard as I think I had imagined. So can you explain a bit
Yeah,
to others who
actually,
aren't practitioners how you
in
go?
all departments, in every function, there's someone in charge of data and analytics because their current metric systems or dashboards are available. So utilizing what's there and what's anyway part of an established reporting process is certainly a good idea. And then you tap into that and go as far as you can. And tapping into that means I just literally plugged it into an Excel sheet and that did the trick. So really nothing fancy. And then, of course, over time, things got refined and more robust and broader, and the algorithms got more sophisticated. But at the beginning, it was simply taking what's there. The four base functions of calculation, maybe a VLOOKUP, and then that's it.
Mhm.
Um, things on the There are, of course, data sources that are then external to a company that one needs to tap into. But luckily, in the meantime, all of that is well described.
Mm.
Um, and things have greatly evolved. I guess the greatest gap still, and I hope this will be resolved within the next few months, is the topic of supply chain transparency. There's now benchmarks for 10 sectors and countries available, and on the back of that, I hope there will be a tool that provides visibility so that any company could provide their spend structure and get out their environmental and social impacts about some 15 or 18 or so parameters, which would be kind of cool, right? To just get a first cut, not to say that one should stop there. Of course not. Getting data is just the entry ticket for more. But so just to ensure that one doesn't get hung up at precisely that question of where to get the data from, it will be another huge step forward.
Mhm. And while we're on this topic, so you also write in the book that the topic of primary data comes up a lot, but most of the time there just isn't enough ready to use primary data out there, and so you have to go for a statistical approach. Again, for the uninitiated, can you explain a little bit that distinction and what it means in terms of this process of doing impact valuation?
Yeah, ideally, we would be able to assess any company in its full value chain, that is its own operations, but all its products and services and their impacts, but also its entire supply chain. So in this entirety, the question is, where can data come from when it's not available within the own organization? Where do you go to? And of course, you can go and ask customers or vendors to share their data, and then it comes. It may not be legally possible. They may not have the data, it may be too sensitive, and so forth and so forth. And projects like the Carbon Disclosure Project have attempted to actually remediate that by having an anonymous platform where you can put in your data. Now, sounded like a tremendously good idea. Unfortunately, we could see that it's been weaker than the statistics. So statistics would be utilizing trade interrelation statistics by the systems of national accounts, an established way that governments utilize to primarily calculate the GDP, but can be superimposed with environmental and social matters to get in the same type of thinking and operating the supply chain impacts for social and environmental matters. And if you do, then you have that transparency that we lack so so extremely at the moment.
So, and this may be a stupid question, but does that not make it does that not create a challenge in terms of tracking whether what you're doing, with your suppliers, for example, is moving?
Totally. So the thing is, in the absence of something perfect, what do? You sit and wait, hoping that someone else resolves the issue or that it gets resolved by itself, or you move ahead with second best, and then with that second best, you see how far it goes, right? And then the one or the other supplier actually are quite vocal about their sustainability targets or ambitions on their home pages. So, there's an entry point to actually take them up on these claims or these statements and get them to react on the data that you have. And, then that creates a mechanism of engagement and creating a way forward. But yeah, I mean, ideally one gets vendor primary data, and clearly the world has moved on since 2015, and now these data sharing and availability of particularly carbon data at vendors is at an entirely different level, because everybody anyway has to report that. So that's now a bit taken care of. So I'm but and that's a welcome evolution, because this now means that you can bring together the specificity of that single vendor, possibly with their supply chain, possibly without, right? But you can replace that chunk of your statistics with that more correct data point, and therefore improve the entirety of your readout. So yeah, I mean, it's for the foreseeable future, it needs to be a mix, because particularly for, well, it depends on your position in the value chain, but the further you're close to customers or the end product, the longer your vendors and the vendors of the vendor, the further you're away from the primary sourcing of agricultural, mining or so products, and then you won't be able to directly influence that. So in the absence of that full transparency, you can still move ahead and then work your way forward through mechanisms of engagement.
Understood. And so this is, having made it sound very easy at the beginning, it's already starting to sound a little bit more complicated to me. And then you get to the next part, which is you need to pick some coefficients, right? To do the valuation part, you need to decide, we've got all of these raw impact numbers for CO2, for labor standards, health and safety, et cetera. And now we need to decide what we're going to multiply it by to come up with a dollar figure. So can you explain again, like where do you then go to get those numbers?
Yeah, that's a fascinating topic, but in the meantime, rather commoditized. So WIFO and GIST have jointly published a rather comprehensive set of valuation coefficients. Then there are some environmental departments of governments. Germany comes to mind. CE Delft in the Netherlands have always been rather a perfectionist about environmental impacts. Clearly, the topic of social cost of carbon has been studied a lot. So here, you don't need to spend a lot of time using the search engine of your trust and liking to find something that suits your purposes.
Understood. And maybe this may not be an answerable question, but you mentioned social cost of carbon, which, yes, it's been studied a lot, but still, like the estimates for social cost of carbon, depending on who you talk to, can vary by orders of magnitude, right? There are, and especially when it gets politicized and happen in the US, but some people could say the right cost of carbon to use is in the tens of dollars, and somebody else could say it's in the thousands of dollars. And when you have that level of discrepancy, surely that makes it really, really challenging to figure out, what number do we use to come up with a sensible valuation here?
Well, you ask 10 experts, you get 100 answers. So that's the same here. But in the meantime, there are use cases, and it's well described. The Capitalist Coalition have issued in my mind, too long a paper, but a paper describing on what you need to look for in a good valuation coefficient. So all of that is really nicely described. Clearly, your entry point of having a market value doesn't cut it, because most things are not tradable, shouldn't be tradable, and therefore there's no available price. So it's more about damage cost, restoration cost, value in use types of consideration that help you determine that, and that very much depends on, well, what is your business situation, what resonates most, and what suits the purpose of your analysis. And I guess it makes a huge difference whether this is about an investment proposal that has a larger plan to stay there for 20 years, or whether it's a shorter term thing, or if it's about the impact performance of last year, right? So here are different options that need to flow. Where does it make sense, and what, like in financial accounting, right? What do you need to do to most adequately reflect reality?
Mm-hmm.
And then footnote.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that, that's one of the things I really liked in reading the book, and about the way you talk about it, is it's really clear that this, this isn't an exercise in valuation for valuation's sake. This is all about how do you influence decision making, how do you open up different conversations internally and with stakeholders that lead to better decisions about new projects, about how you allocate capital, all sorts of strategic things. And if we've kind of pivot, I guess, a little bit to your personal journey into this, and actually even before looking at what you've done on impact valuation, you reference in the book that your background, at least part of your background, was working in IT for some time. And you share in the book a mantra from your IT days that I have to say resonated very strongly with me, as someone who's used to working on strategy projects or reports where you put so much effort into getting the final deck or the final report right, and it gets out there and then everyone's exhausted. And the mantra you use is, at go live, nothing has really happened. So I'm kind of curious about how you think your background, which I guess wasn't in anything necessarily directly to do with impact or impact valuation. Maybe you can give people a little bit of insight into what that background was and how you think it's helped prepare you to do this work at Novartis over the last decade.
Yeah, I've had a background in larger IT implementation projects, and of course there are lots of concepts, and you need to standardize processes and get alignment and make sure that they're all convergent enough to produce a meaningful way of working for all the functions involved. In our case, the entire production, procurement, feeding into financials. Quality systems, forecasting. So then, so all of that requires a lot of thinking on understanding the flows, the processes, the connection points within the business. But truth be told, as long as one works on that, on customizing these systems, the users, the ones actually who should care about that, ideally, still do their work without you. And pretty much, I mean, yes, we've engaged with all these stakeholders on impact valuation, that we wanted to do that we believed it's meaningful, that this is how they could help, this is how they could benefit, and all of that. And then people listen more or less interested, but it doesn't make a difference to them. And then the moment you put something in front of them and they're like, this is it, right? That's the product. So how do you react? Do you like it? What could you do? Is it better, worse, different than what you expected? And then it starts, right? The construction of the product itself is necessary, but not sufficient for that engagement part. And the entire in IT projects is then called change management, and put in a lot of effort in getting people to understand the new processes and get comfortable with new systems and so forth. So this analogy I found very helpful, because actually from an internal perspective, one thing's like, I've done everything, I've done my part, right? So I'm done. But this is when it truly only starts and the rubber hits the road. So I found that a very, very strong metaphor to actually also help me understand that while it's now all there and understood and discussed and so forth of the project team and with the steering committee also, that's a starting point. It's just a starting point for the real thing to come.
Yeah. I want to dive a bit deeper on your personal journey, but actually before we do, let's take a little detour. And I should say, as a call out, thank you, Ashwani, for your comment in the chat. Others, please do feel free to post comments, questions that we can get to before too long. But the detour I want to go on is, so I said at the beginning, the book came out in 2022. We have the fun of being able to look at it retrospectively and see how it stacks up in a rather changed world. Because I guess 2022, looking back, feels like a very different world, right?
Oh yeah.
ESG was going to take over the world. Shareholder capitalism was dead, and the future was stakeholder capitalism. I think lots of people thought Trump was a one-term president, and the world had moved on from the aberration of those 4 years. And now here we are, and I have to say, reading the book recently, I think it's aged pretty well. I think like anyone in our space who put pen to paper or finger to keypad in that period in the early 2020s has to kind of now look back with a little bit of trepidation at what we thought and what we wrote about, and how much we maybe got suckered into the hype around things like ESG. I certainly remember putting together decks for clients, citing reports from Deutsche Bank or whoever saying, by 2030, 90% of assets under management globally are going to be, managed in line with ESG. And it was all a bit fuzzy what it meant, but there was kind of like everyone was using these slides and these graphs that just showed exponential growth, and so this is all going mainstream so fast. And as I say, I think mostly you did very well to avoid getting swept up in that hype. But there are a couple of sentences in the book I wanted to read to you now and see whether you stand by them. So the first one is actually not about ESG, but about impact. You wrote in the book that impact investing is well on the way to becoming mainstream. Now, I guess this also gets us into the kind of question of ESG versus impact, which you also unpack a bit in the book. But how you in 2025 feel about the mainstream of impact investing? Are you still as bullish on that as you were 3 years ago?
Yeah, well, the things are on the impact investing side are incredibly successful. I mean, assets under management are still increasing. It's still increasing double digit as the only asset class. So I guess everyone working with and for Gin and their network can be super happy. And another indicator of success is that nowadays any corporate responsibility or sustainability or ESG integrated report is now an impact report. So people seem to like the narrative. Now, if they like the underpinning work, that's a different story. And whether that has consistently the same robustness, I doubt. But clearly, well, the signs were on the wall a bit for ESG very early on. I guess with the Bloomberg article on the ESG mirage pointing out some of the early flaws, and what was that? Harvard Business Review article, like ESG reporting doesn't replace true sustainability or something of this sort. So these were articles at the time of the ESG mirages come out before, and I think that Harvard Business Review article must have come out roundabout at that time. And then now lately it's more, is ESG dead? Is ESG over? But I think that the main question still is, well, maybe certain forms, or maybe a hype, maybe there's now more sobriety, but the need for long-term value creation and understanding how businesses can and have to adapt to a changed environment, of expectations of a changed geopolitical environment. Now, all of a sudden, economic resilience is much more important. Supply chain resilience is much more important. And then all of a sudden, those outside in, inside out perspectives get an entirely different value than they used to get. So it's I guess certain things have certainly gone a bit overboard. The ESG baby of the UNEP FI has been born to actually cater for the materiality of pricing equities, right? It's the materiality of of pricing equities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a rather narrow, has been a rather narrow lens from the start, and hasn't intended to address what is the value creation, value destruction of business activities on society nature, and what would actually, on that matter, same analogy works for national budgets. Every country, they have their budget for the next year or the years to come. One could easily superimpose that with an impact thinking and understand how this or not helps us get closer to the UN SDGs they all signed this up for, right? So that essence remains, and which means there are lots of starting points for meaningful conversations in what are the relevant items. And certainly it's not the long laundry list, and it needs to be very business and context specific, but then you can meaningfully engage to have a conversation on a better way forward. And I think this is what this is about. Sorry, I digressed from your question, Richard.
That's all good. And it was, you answered the question as well. But the other line I wanted to read out and see what you think about it now is around impact transparency. So so in the book you quote, so as most people know, Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, publishes a letter to the CEOs of the companies they own shares of every, I think it normally comes out in January. And when the book came out in 2020, you quoted what was then the most recent Larry Fink letter, which was made a very emphatic case for stakeholder capitalism as the future, and saying, you know, this is how all companies should be managed. And you then commented in relation to that, you think it's just a matter of time before Larry Fink's letter is demanding impact transparency.
Well, I guess it's a matter of at least 3.5 years.
You still think Larry will get there eventually?
Well, who knows? Actually, I hadn't anticipated a world of geopolitical strains the way we experience them now. Um, um, Interesting times, the speed of change. So everyone is a bit on their toes, so hard to predict. But I think the essence of wanting to know what makes a difference and what truly improves things, and now with increasing transparency and broader data availability, if that gets organized, and it can be organized to actually have meaningful readouts, then yes, I would think that because it gets easier for anyone to see these types of transparency, benchmarks are available, so you can now challenge any institution, any company in those 10 sectors on, like, okay, tell me how you perform better or worse than the benchmark that wasn't there before. So anyone who has an interest in sustainability could go and do that. So by commoditizing these tools and approaches, anybody who has a true interest in longer term value creation can actually do things much more on on their laptop, basically. So without a lot of field research going out themselves.
Yeah. And
so I think it's a matter of time. Yeah.
It's a matter of time, could be, but let's not be too specific.
And I don't think centuries. I think it's a matter of even I will be still there to see that.
But do you think it's going to be the push for greater impact transparency? Like, how much of that do you think will now come from the financial community? I'm not talking Larry Fink specifically, versus the other great hope of people who want to see more transparency around this has been regulation. And we have seen
how much. Super interesting question. I don't know. I think for all of these groups, there will be some actors who think, well, wait a minute, that can't be it. And what has actually happened to the essence of this all, and who want to dig deeper. And this trend, I believe, is visible. So a lot of the hype has gone away, and a lot of the empty words are now down to an essence. And I don't know how many, but I think it will be a meaningful minority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, we could continue down this rabbit hole, but yeah. Jocelyn put a question in the chat about 10 minutes ago that I have been meaning to get to, which takes us back into the kind of practical discussion about this. And the question is, can you talk a little about moving from output to impact in assessing social responsibility initiatives? So Jocelyn works in the extractive sector, and it can be difficult to agree on metrics. So is that clear enough, Sonja? Otherwise, I'll ask Jocelyn to come off mute and say a little bit more.
Yeah, but my reaction will anyway be questions to Jocelyn. So, well, the thing is, what problem are we trying to solve here? And I guess when those social responsibility initiatives are anyway underway and they're anyway funded, what's the point, right? To be a bit provocative. So the question is, what do you need those metrics for? And then which challenge are you trying to address? And once that is understood, all of those questions on which metrics, how to go about them, which ones are better and which ones are worse, are much easier to answer than it's like you need to think of a tool set and then provide the right one to the challenge at hand. But maybe I totally misunderstood what you were asking. Then I apologize.
Jocelyn, do you want to jump in, give us a little bit more of your perspective on this?
Sure. I'm just curious. I mean, what we often see in terms of measurement, especially when you put a dollar value on things, is that I work in the mining sector. So mining companies often report on the amount of money that's been invested in community development activities. But the challenge for that, as we know, is that's really an output. It doesn't measure the impact of those dollars invested. And so sometimes agreeing to the metrics of how we move along that spectrum from output to impact can be quite challenging. So, we look at sustainability reports for mining companies, you see lots of things about local employment. Okay, but that doesn't really give us impact in terms of what happens when the mine closes and all those jobs go away. Is there a strategy for just transition? Or we talk about infrastructure projects that companies invest in for communities, but is that really advancing sustainable development? So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on, just sort of making that leap, as it were, from outputs, obviously important, a step on the journey, towards true impact for sustainable development.
Well, on those jobs created, a subsequent question would be, are these jobs to be proud of? So how would an impact of wages and salaries paid look like in comparison to living wage? So what is the change in well-being? I mean, the guiding question is how has the community well-being changed? And then can we trace this somehow? Greater access to social security, to banking, to healthcare are typically elements that can be utilized to then get to a proxy of, well, what is life expectancy entirely without? And we have countries with very low life expectancy and then you can get to a starting point of an assessment of what the impact may be. Ideally is you trace, of course, these things over several years, and then that's the data creation on the ground, which takes all the effort. So then then again the question is, what do you do this for? If it's just to report, maybe it's good enough then, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Jocelyn, for the question, and Sonja. I'm conscious we're coming towards the end of time, so I do want to talk a little bit about your personal journey and your learnings along this way. I don't know how you feel, Sonja, about the term intrapreneur, but it's certainly one that I'm sure or other people have applied to you, whether it's one you feel comfortable with or not. That you say at the start of the book, this is impact valuation is something you started working on in 2015. So this is now a decade-long journey for you professionally, and as you've already alluded to, that started with some pilots, some work with specific businesses in specific markets, and has scaled over time. As you step back and reflect on that, and again, for those who haven't read the book, I recommend it, because there is a section at the end where you share some of these lessons. But without going into all of that, Sonja, when you reflect on your journey as an entrepreneur, what do you feel like the hardest earned lessons you've got over the last decade are?
Well, okay. It all centers around engagement and what are meaningful contributions to a discussion. And those discussions can be hostile at the beginning, or they can be opposing, or they can be not desired by your targeted counterpart at all. So to try and lean in and overcome those hurdles, it's been rather a thing to improve on and to get better and learn a lot. This is how I learned a lot, really, in how to pivot to an interpretation, a perspective that is relevant to the person I'm speaking to, and not necessarily my vision of the impact economy coming to bear. Who cares? Apart from, there are certainly people who care, but that's not their prime concern at work, or it's not their prime concern in their business responsibility. So what is it that they care about, or that they need to have resolved, or what are the challenges they are faced with? And can I find a link from that to my universe of responsibility? And I think that's been in the sense hardest learned, in that this has taken time to get the versatility and the flexibility, and also the tool set to actually have something to offer, right? It's all then built on use cases, and it becomes ever easier if you can say, well, others who were in your situation actually did that, and I can show you the list of what happened there. Then it's easier. But starting from nothing to build that and get first movers in those various fields has been quite something, and really did require entrepreneurship. Actually, the first time someone called me that and nominated me along those lines at the Aspen Institute First Movers Fellows, I was like, what? Didn't even know the term existed. But yeah, I guess this is what it is, and I think it sums it up quite nicely.
And so we're maybe coming a little bit full circle back to where we started with Scott Fitzgerald quote about being able to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time. Carrie's just put something in the chat around how we grapple with the reductionist approaches to assessing both value and impact. There was a comment much earlier from Ashwani about the Western mindset and the Oriental mindset. The former is binary and mechanistic, latter non-binary, organic, open to evolutionary change. And you may want to address some of the themes in those comments, questions directly, but I just wanted to, there was one line in the epilogue to the book that really was one that I underlined, because it really resonated and struck me as well, which is, complexity needs to be effectively managed, not unduly reduced.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of, I'm interested in how you, yeah, I think that's clearly a really important thought that is at the heart of this whole debate and this practice. I wonder if you can just say a little bit more about how you personally think about, deal with that complexity in a way that isn't too reductionist, isn't just let's simplify things.
Yeah, and that's thanks for bringing us back to the beginning. Exactly. To me, a lot of that, the two things that I need to keep in mind constantly are the short term, what are the practical, concrete projects that I can do with business for a core business to advance, help someone advance, while still helping me advance longer term. And longer term may be tremendously longer term. So what are the side steps, the baby steps that still help advance? And and that is something where I feel that is effectively managing that, because if I start saying, well, I want the impact economy, then it's daunting, and all the energy flows out, right? And I just feel tired and let someone else do it. So now but then what are things that I can do today, and what helps us what helps us get closer to such reality? And here, that is possible. And then when you see that, okay, like if that's successful, then one can build on a new universe. And that is pretty much the story of entrepreneurs, of having a stock of use cases, having things that you can build on, utilize on, then scale. So in the meantime, there's been this Oxford case study with the Side School of Business on the impact journey at Novartis, whereby I describe how we move things from exploratory to pilot to scale to repeat, to just move from rough ideas of one would want to actually impact measure something, don't quite know how to do it, whether it's feasible at all, can you do it? And then, well, keep things small, experiment, find someone to like it or tell you that it's really not good enough to see the light of the day, and then you move on, right? But then if it's good enough to see the light of the day, then it can be used and can be piloted. And the question is, how can you actually scale this to not just do that twice or 10 times, but globally, year over year repeat? But this is a way to actually get things on constantly better. And of course, the challenges I'm facing in my day-to-day are now totally different than I enjoyed 10 years ago. And that's a sign of how the field has advanced and how the work has become much more mature.
Yes. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But I think that's a good place to finish anyway. So thank you so much, Sonja. Thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion. It's been a real pleasure for me anyway to get to explore a few different rabbit holes with you, Sonja. So thank you for allowing me to go well off.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure, and sorry that we didn't get to answer all of the questions. Happy to engage with you. You'll find me easily on LinkedIn. So thank you all. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Pleasure. And everyone, we will share the recording as usual and be in touch about next book club. There won't be a book club next month, but I believe we will be back in September and normal service will be resumed, which means it'll be Louise rather than me. But thank you all for joining for today, and have a good evening, good day, wherever you are.